What is good, my reflections? What is good, my babies? We are over here talking about Egyptian writing and the different parts of the Egyptian writing system. And we talked a lot about in the last video, we were talking about scribes and how the scribes were a very essential and important factor throughout the Egyptian writing system. Okay. The scribes were actually the only ones who knew how to read and write hieroglyphs. Okay. So, for everyone who didn't catch that video, I will definitely link it in the description box below. But with that being said, let's just do a little overview for everyone who didn't catch the video, okay? On what a scribe is and kind of what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so for everyone who didn't catch that video or just new with Egyptian history, a scribe is an ancient Egyptian man or woman who learned to read and write hieroglyphics in Heretic, which is a shorter form of hieroglyphics. Okay, and we talked in the last video how to identify hieroglyphics and heretics. Okay, there were only the scribe had two main duties in Egypt. Okay, so the main duties of the scribes were to keep government records, and they also made sure that they wrote letters for the pharaoh. So when pharaohs needed certain letters to be sent out or certain letters to reach other pharaohs, then they would depend on the scribes. Okay, they were the only people in ancient Egypt who could read and write the sacred hieroglyphics that would appear on temples and the tombs. Okay, and in the last video we discussed the difference in a hieroglyphic and a heretic. Okay, so with that being said, let's talk about what a lot of people hear the term papyrus, but they may not necessarily know what is papyrus. Papyrus was a reed that, well, it is a reed that grew in ancient Egypt that was used in many different ways. It was cut into strips, pressed together, pounded, and dried to make into sheets, which were written on. That's where you get your word paper from, papyrus. Okay, papyrus was also gathered and tied together in bundles and used to make small fishing boats. Papyri is the plural form of papyrus. Okay, so just a little overview. So, with that being said, let's get into the different systems and how were the how. Okay, now that we know what hieroglyphics is, let's get into how were they used. Okay, so hieroglyphics, we also talked about to become a scribe, they actually had to go to a scribe school for 4 to 5 years, okay? Because we know how important hieroglyphics is in keeping documents of things, especially in the Egyptian culture. So, what is a scribe school and what does it consist of? Students in ancient Egyptian scribe schools had many things to learn. Since it was important for them to learn how to record information correctly, they had to read and write well. They spent hours copying hundreds of signs until they could make them well enough to please their teachers. This was hard work, and many students did not like the work they were given. Sometimes they were even punished for skipping classes or not doing their work. That sounds like King Tut. If you go back and you especially listen or read some of his books, I mean, some books that was written about him, he had that punishment often. Okay. So with that being said, this is actually a scribe student's practice board or practice board. On the left side of the board, you can actually see grids, okay, the grid lines. And you will notice through a lot of hieroglyphics that you will see those grid lines. And as we talk more about hieroglyphics, you will see why. So they actually use this to draw pictures, okay, we'll draw hieroglyphics. Okay, so on the right side, you can actually see where the student has copied hieroglyphics several times. Remember, they will practice the hieroglyphics until they get better and better and better. And different hieroglyphics can be very complex. Okay, so with that being said, let's keep going. What about the army? Okay, even this is how important scribes were and how important not all of Egypt depended on scribes, even the army. When ancient Egyptians went to battle against their enemies, they used writing to communicate with each other. Remember, symbols are numbers, numbers are symbols, and there's codes in all of them. Military leaders were first trained as scribes. So, in order to become a military leader, you had to become a scribe first. So, they would be able to read the messages that were sent to them. So, this is actually a picture right here of Egyptians going into battle. Okay. So, with that being said, let's keep going. Okay, what about in the fields? Okay, so what about after they finished scribe school. So, one of the first jobs that a scribe might have after they finish scribe school was working in the fields counting crops or animals. This is a wall painting from the tomb of a nobleman called Neb Ammon. Okay, so it was important, and it's called geese. All right, this is geese. Okay, it was important for a nobleman to keep track of how many animals he owned. One way to do this was to get the scribes to count the animals and write down the number on the papyrus. So this is actually a picture of the geese reflection. Okay. So let's keep it going. So that was very important for them to keep track of that, and the ones who would keep track of it is the scribes. So what role did the scribes have in government? Okay, the government of ancient Egypt kept records about the country. This helped them work out important facts about how the country was running. For example, by looking at records from the past years, they could see how much grain or how many animals collected in taxes. Okay, so what were taxes? Taxes were basically a percentage of a person's yearly income or crops that was collected by the pharaoh. Okay, so even back then, they would have a certain amount of crops that would go towards the pharaoh. Okay, and kind of see where the foundation of this system comes from today. It says government officials were scribes who had been promoted to higher positions. Okay, so they were government officials were scribes. They were originally scribes who had been promoted to higher positions. Okay, one scribe named Horemheb, who was a high government official, actually became a pharaoh. So he at first started off as a scribe, then he became a government official, and then he became a pharaoh. Okay. So scribes were very important. Okay, so what about in the tombs? What about in the tombs? What did the scribes practice? I mean, what were their roles in tombs? Okay. Scribes wrote spells on the walls of tombs before they were carved. Then the craftsmen decorating the tomb carved the hieroglyphic or painted them. Finally, the head scribe checked over the work that had been done to make sure it was correct. That's where you see the grid sign. So all this right here, the scribes had to actually come in and do this first, then it was painted over reflection. Okay. Remember, the craftsmen could not always read what they were carving onto the walls, and a missed line or sign could mean that the spells would not work. So they couldn't even, the craftsmen, they didn't know how to read the hieroglyphics. They're just painting, and you get what I'm saying, carving out the particular image that they see. So the scribes will actually go back over it after they're done and make sure that nothing is missed, because these were very important spells that were wrote on these tombs. Okay, so writing was very important part of the tomb decoration. As you can see, the writings on the walls in the pharaoh's tomb helped them get to the afterlife. So you can imagine. So that showed you how important the scribes were. They played various roles through Egypt. Okay. So with that being said, let's keep going. What about in the temples? What about the temples? The temples was houses of the gods and goddesses. The walls were decorated with writings and pictures that showed the pharaoh's respect for the gods and goddesses. Okay, priests who worked in the temples were scribes. All right, they were the people who performed the sacred rituals that were necessary to keep the gods and goddesses happy. Thus, they needed to be able to read the instructions for the rituals that were written on the papyrus scrolls and carved into the temple walls. These tools were used for carving wall reliefs. Okay, so what is a relief? A relief is a word used to describe scenes and symbols and figures that are carved onto a wall or a slab of rock. Sunken relief is when the main aspects of the picture are carved into the rock or other hard surfaces. Raised relief is when the background of the scene is carved out so that the main figures and the symbols stick out. Okay. So that's kind of self-explanatory. All right. So they had different reliefs. Okay, so with that being said, reflection, I definitely want to come over here and I want to talk to you about, we talked about scribes, but I want to talk to you about the importance of scribes. We're going to get more and more into the Egyptian history and different writing systems, but I wanted to talk about one of the key factors in Egypt, which were the scribes. So with that being said, reflection, we cannot forget god of writing, the god of scribing, and that would be Tha. So with that being said, reflection, hit that like and subscribe button. Join us all week. We're over here talking about Egyptian history. You're with Terethia. Ashe.